A few years ago, fishermen trawling the floor of the North Sea started pulling up something strange in their nets alongside the cod and herring. Not trash, not debris from shipwrecks. Bones. Human bones, and alongside them flint tools, carved antlers, and the remains of animals that no longer exist on this continent. They were hauling up a civilization that nobody remembered. The North Sea is not supposed to have a floor full of human history. It is supposed to be just ocean, and yet beneath roughly 40 meters of water, spread across an area roughly 1/4 the size of Europe, there is a drowned world. It had rivers, it had forests of oak and elm and hazel. It had hills and valleys and wetlands thick with fish and deer and wild horse. And for thousands of years, people lived there. They built fires, they raised families, they watched their world disappear one season at a time under the rising water, and they survived. What they did next is one of the most important and least told stories in human history. The land is called Doggerland. 12,000 years ago, the area now covered by the North Sea was solid ground, connecting what we now call Britain to continental Europe. The ice sheets that had locked away vast amounts of water across the planet were beginning to retreat. As they melted, sea levels rose by more than 120 meters. That process took thousands of years. It was not a single dramatic wave. It was slow, relentless, and unstoppable. To understand what this meant for the people living there, you have to first understand what Doggerland was. Around 10,000 years ago, as Europe was emerging from the last ice age, ancient hunter-gatherers of what archaeologists call the Mesolithic period inhabited this land. The rich habitats of marshlands, valleys, rivers, and lakes drew groups from across the region, looking for fish, birds, and fresh water. These were not primitive cave dwellers. Evidence of hearths and butchered animal bones shows that life here was not just about survival, but about community and adaptation. They understood their landscape. They had mapped it seasonally and generationally in their minds and in their stories. And then the water came. Around 8,000 BCE, sea levels may have been rising as much as 6 feet per century. That is roughly 2 centimeters a year. In a single human lifetime, the shoreline would shift noticeably. A child born near a river estuary might, as an old person, watch that same estuary swallowed by salt water. The process was slow enough to observe across a life, but fast enough that no single generation could stop it. What geologists and archaeologists have established is that the people of Doggerland did not wait to drown. Low-lying camps and coastal settlements were abandoned as the water advanced. Some coastal communities moved to nearby higher ground. Others left behind settlements that are now entirely underwater. The response was not panic. It was migration. Incremental, generational, hard. Then came something that was not incremental at all. Around 6,150 years before the Common Era, researchers have confirmed that a tsunami, triggered by an underwater landslide near Norway known as the Storegga Slide, struck what remained of Doggerland. A landslide on the ocean floor roughly the size of Iceland sent walls of water across the North Sea. The people still living on the last elevated patches of that shrinking land had minutes, not years. For the people living there, it must have been a terrifying, world-ending catastrophe, one that forced survivors to flee to higher ground, and yet they survived. A recent study by British and Estonian scientists showed a small part of Doggerland and its people survived the aftermath. Parts of the landmass appeared to have remained above water until roughly 7,000 years ago, allowing Doggerland to act as a critical ecological and human refuge, shaping settlement patterns across northern Europe. The survivors did not simply scatter and vanish. They carried their knowledge, their tools, and their memories with them onto the higher ground that would eventually become Britain and the Netherlands. Doggerland is the most well-documented case, but it is not unique. Some indigenous Australian stories describe coastlines that existed thousands of years ago before rising seas flooded them. Researchers have found that these oral traditions align with geological evidence of ancient shoreline. People preserve the memory of lands that no longer exist, passed down across hundreds of generations, accurate enough that modern geologists can verify them against the seafloor record. The story of a world swallowed by water was not myth. It was memory.